Good morning, everyone. I hope everyone's doing well. Welcome to the latest installment of the QuakeCoRE monthly seminar series. I'm really proud to introduce today Joanne Stevenson. Joanne is based here in Christchurch, working for resilient organisations, and was also a recent PhD graduate from the University of Canterbury a few years back now. And she'll be talking to us today about work that her and colleagues from resilient organisations have been doing in conjunction with a few other people, including market economics and GNS, looking at productivity following the Kaikōura earthquake. So I'll hand over to Jo, and really looking forward to hearing from you today, and I'm sure there'll be lots of questions afterwards.
Yeah, great. Thanks so much, Brendan. Thanks everyone for showing up. This is really an exciting project for us to be able to finally present, because it's been several months of getting a lot of moving parts to come together to produce a really sort of in-depth picture of the impact of both the Kaikōura earthquake and a potential future Alpine Fault rupture on government productivity in Wellington. So we'll get into kind of all the different stages of the research and how they came together to inform the merit economic modeling tool and understand the impacts of this potential fault rupture on the economy and how government disruptions can propagate following disasters. So just quickly acknowledge the team. I'm with Resilient Organizations, and I was working with Erica Seville, Kayleen Sampson, and also Charlotte Brown, who I left off the slides. Very sorry to Charlotte. She couldn't make it today. Actually, she was going to be here. And then Nikki Smith and Gary McDonald from Market Economics, and Nick Horspool was representing RiskScape from GNS. So why look at government productivity in an economic modeling environment? So what we've found in the development of economic modeling tools is that government productivity is actually really difficult to represent in traditional economic models. The reason is because in a traditional productivity model, you have inputs, you have the systems that modify those inputs and turn them into outputs and then outcomes for people. Well, there's not a lot of ability to capture some of the government outputs that aren't priced. So you have things like hospital services or medical services in New Zealand that you're not charging for at market costs. And so when there's a disruption to those, it would be it would look very bad. It would be very unpopular for the hospital to raise their prices in order to moderate demand. And so we actually need to treat these kind of services and these kind of organizations very differently when we're looking at how they might be affected by a disaster. So the government sector, as I said, can't raise price, they can't moderate the disruptions in that way, but what we know is that even a small change in government productivity can actually have a significant flow-on effect through the economy, because just because they're not producing goods that are accurately priced in a market doesn't mean that they're not affecting households' ability to consume. They're not they are affecting people's ability to get around, to deliver goods, to do all of the things that make economies function. So it's actually incredibly important that we understand the way that government organizations behave in an economy and the way that impacts on them would propagate in an economic model. So this project, the objective of it was to develop a module for the merit model, which I'll talk a lot more about throughout this presentation, so don't worry if you're not familiar with it, which better accounts for the economic losses that would transpire as a result of government disruptions, and then to run that module with impacts associated with an Alpine Fault rupture to assess the probable economic consequences of government productivity losses. So the outcome of this project ultimately has been to enhance our ability to assess the economic impact of actual and possible disruptive events that affect government agencies. And the reason why we want to do this, as I was saying, is to inform intervention strategies. So if we know how government agencies are affected by something like building disruptions, infrastructure disruptions, then we can kind of see, well, where are the vulnerabilities? What kind of things? How long is it going to take them to relocate? What are their actions? What are their adaptive actions? Where can we actually intervene in the system to modify and mitigate some of these impacts in the wider economy? So I just put this, it's a really simplified example of how all the inputs go into the economic model. So what we're going to be talking about today, sorry, I pointing to the screen for the people in the room, is the fact that we've incorporated a hazard impact model, so an actual scenario that was developed by GNS and also with Brendan Bradley's help, the YO Alpine Fault Rupture scenario. Ignore the bits in brown. That's kind of where our government module has gone. So those are just kind of modifying scenarios that will help us understand sort of the direct costs and the impacts on the sort of economic outputs. So as I said, this was a multi-stage project. So the part that was most engaged in, I'm most familiar with, is the very first stage. So we were looking at the impacts of, there, we'll do that. So we were looking at the impacts of the Kaikōura earthquake on actual government functionality. So this is one of the great things that we've been able to do with the merit model is, you know, we've been lucky in some ways in New Zealand to have a lot of really great action case studies at our doorstep where we can go in and see how businesses are and organizations are behaving in the face of significant disruption. So we did this back in 2014 by looking at some of the major impacts on Christchurch businesses, and we developed the business behaviors model. And then with the sort of opportunity of the Kaikōura earthquake, we were able to go into Wellington and actually see some of the real life disruptions to government agencies in the Wellington CBD. Of course, we recognize that the Kaikōura earthquake isn't a direct proxy for something like an Alpine Fault rupture, but it was actually fairly significant in the Wellington CBD. So we went to Wellington, we talked to several government agencies. We did a focus group with 5 government agencies and then follow-up interviews with 4 case study organizations. Looking at things like how long they were out of their buildings for, how they were making their decisions, how they were doing catching up on work, how they actually divided their services into critical and non-critical functions, and getting a sense of how organizations might actually adapt and respond and catch up on productivity in the event of a disruption. So that's my part of the work, and if you have questions, I'll be very able to answer those. The rest of the stuff, I might have to defer to the report, but I've done my best to really become familiar with the processes, so I'll do my best today. So the second stage was we took that and we joined it with a disaster scenario that was developed for RiskScape for the Alpine Fault AF8 project. And so this was an Alpine YRL fault rupture, and I'll have a map later on showing you kind of where that is. We selected this particular rupture because it was sort of the northern extent of what a possible Alpine Fault rupture might look like, and therefore having kind of a possibly larger impact on the Wellington CBD. So we might be able to see the economic impacts more clearly. And as part of this scenario development, we had to get and use lots of building survey data for who's actually in buildings in the Wellington CBD. It's actually trickier than it sounds. It took us a kind of a huge effort to get information about where government employees are actually based and who's in those buildings, but we did it, which was so exciting. So we have actually a very in-depth understanding of who was being affected in these potential scenarios. And then the final step was to take these 2 pieces of input, this idea, the first phase, which helped us understand how organizations might be affected and might behave, plus the scenario, and put it into the merit model module to run sort of an understanding of how these impacts might flow through an economy. Okay, so starting with phase 1. This is the data collection, so just to give you a little bit of background on the kinds of agencies we're looking at. We'll be the first to admit that it's not representative. There's a huge range of different types of organizations. We really got in-depth data on 4 agencies, but they're huge agencies, and we're just trying to get a sense of how things might be sort of moving around in a post-disaster environment. So we have 4 agencies. None of them wanted to release their names, unfortunately, so we'll call them agencies 1, 2, 3, and 4. And what we saw was every single one of these agencies lost access to their buildings after the Kaikōura earthquake. One had a very minor disruption to IT due to sort of a small power outage, but actually infrastructure outages weren't a huge issue following the Kaikōura earthquake for government agencies in Wellington CBD. And none of them experienced disruptions to third-party suppliers. So these ended up being kind of blind spots. We did look for organizations that had a range of impacts, but really what we were seeing from the Kaikōura earthquake was that it was building disruptions that were the main issue. So this is just an example of a schematic diagram of the kinds of functions that government agencies might have. So what we were seeing is that in the event of a crisis, they were very quickly triaging their services. So we had organizations, every single organization said, these are our critical functions. This is something they actually identify prior to disasters. So they have critical functions and they have less critical functions. So critical functions are self-defined. There's no standard definition for a critical function for a government agency, but it essentially means it's a function that the public is probably depending on. They need to deliver this in order to have, it could be safety, it could be essential social services, it could be something that people really need, and it's something they'll prioritize all their resources. They'll suck resources from other parts of the organization in order to facilitate the continuation of this critical function. They also have non-time critical functions, and so that's the ones that you see kind of dipping. So in order to maintain just standard operating for the critical functions, they needed to suck resources out of their non-critical functions. Or if it was going to be really expensive to get these people who are non-critical functions into temporary locations, they would just say, don't come into work, because it's, we can catch up later. It's not a big deal. And this was actually an interesting finding for us, that there is, I'm sure people who kind of come from a conservative mindset about government spending would say, well, there shouldn't be this kind of slack in the system, but actually following the Kaikōura earthquake, it was a really important sort of resilience aspect for these organizations. And then you have emergency response functions. So not every organization has these, but there will be some organizations. This particular agency was one that had social support functions that it needed to deliver, and those things get ramped up in an emergency. So an emergency function means that you'll have some agencies that actually need to respond to the disaster itself, and that's a really important thing to consider in terms of people are just clamoring at the doors to get in terms of actually reprioritizing resources. Okay, so just to hop right to the phase 1 findings, the primary mechanism for disruption was building disruption. So that was, it's possible that this would also be true in the Alpine Fault scenario, because a lot of it's just going to be shaken damage. We might not see huge infrastructure damage, but we're a little bit dubious about whether or not that will be true. The demand for critical government functions, as I said, actually experienced some increased demand, but non-critical functions experienced reduced demand. So that's again a way of moderating that impact, because people aren't, might not be filing a permit to get a deck put on their house when there's an emergency. The government's ability to meet demand, essentially in this sort of minor case study scenario, was it's going to depend on disruption to critical services and buildings, the ability of the agency to reprioritize staff to demand increases, and the capacity of agency offices outside of Wellington to absorb additional demand. So people that, agencies that had locations in Christchurch or Auckland or outside of the direct Wellington region were able to put their staff out there, put those resources out there. And this is the same kind of thing that we saw with businesses following the Christchurch earthquake. So resorts did a lot of work with all over the Canterbury region with businesses, and we see a lot of the same things. If you can move people to another location, if you can move work to another location, you're going to be better off. You're going to have fewer dips in productivity. And then organizations coped with temporary losses in productivity through the later recapture of production. So some of it was just a loss, but a lot of it was kind of scrambled to recapture later on. And we'll talk about the mechanisms that businesses used to recapture that productivity. So this is the conceptual model that we used to inform some of the assumptions that then went into the government productivity module in the merit model. So it's pretty basic, and if you want more details, you can read the report. But yeah, we have our outside functions, the buildings and the infrastructure functions that were disrupted. So the orange triangles represent some kind of change, disruption. What we didn't see, but what we still want to include in the model, is third-party functions and the interdependency between things like banking services and things like, all of those other services that support government agencies' ability to operate. We have critical functions, non-critical functions, and then the consumers who were actually dictating the way that resources were reprioritized in the government agencies. So people were clamoring for XY services, so they took certain, capacity from Z service and put it into XY service. Okay, so phase 2. This is the RiskScape Alpine Fault Rupture. So this is really just to show you kind of where we're looking. So I'm sure Brendan could give you a lot more information about this particular scenario because he was instrumental in developing it. But we had looked previously at doing something a bit more with a southern Alpine Fault rupture, but we just weren't seeing the building damage results, and so it wasn't that exciting from an economic modeling. So we kind of turned up the volume on what a potential disruption could be, just for the sake of being able to see it in the model. I'm sure there would be disruptions from Alpine Fault that from a lower Alpine Fault rupture, but we wanted to see the actual building damage. So when the RiskScape, we had 10 RiskScape runs, so we ran it several times to just get a bigger range of the types of disruptions that we might see to building infrastructure in Wellington. And this is the kind of outputs we got. So it was GIS layers giving us a range of damage. And the range, so in the 10 model runs, we had about, I think it was 3 to 45 buildings that would have been either completely out of commission, collapsed, or completely just unable to be used. And then a huge range of, was I think somewhere between up to 700 buildings that would be really out of commission for a very long time. And that's the kind of information that we were getting from phase 2. As I said, in addition to this data, because that's great, we had a sense of the building disruption. But as we looked at it, we said, well, where are the government agencies there? Not everybody works out of the beehive. So we had to actually use a building survey that was done by Olga Filipova from University of Auckland. And she had done a really, really in-depth building use survey that said, these are the agencies in certain buildings. But then we found that government agencies actually split their staff across a number of buildings in some cases. And so we had to work with the government property group, who were they overcame so many barriers to try and get us this data, and they finally came through right at the 11th hour to help us understand how many employees were in each building, and then we can tie that to the level of disruption. So we really got a good picture of who was being affected for how long. Okay, so this is the merit model. It stands for, merit actually stands for measuring the economics of a resilient infrastructure tool, and it was developed from a project that was funded between 2012 and 2016 by ENVI as part of the Economics of Resilient Infrastructure program. And it was really about supporting investment decisions for asset owners. So it was about understanding how a disruption to certain types of infrastructure, certain types of infrastructure disruptions would affect the economy overall, how it would propagate through a region, propagate through the country, and where we should prioritize our spending in order to get the best resilience bang for our buck. So that's where the merit model came, that was the reason it came into being. What has happened since then is that we've developed things like the business behaviors module that takes lots and lots of empirical data from the Christchurch earthquakes and understands how businesses adapt and respond, and actually modify the impacts that you're going to see in the economy. And we have other things, the population relocation module. There's a transport one that was developed. Not all of these were used in this particular run. We have the basic dynamic economic model, and then we had the government module and some coordinate analysis. So for those of you that are interested in wanting to know more about this stuff, I can tell you a little bit that basically merit incorporates sort of core features of computable equilibrium modeling, but it's not a CGE model. It's a systems dynamic module, and it's formulated on finite difference equations. And so when we were doing things like trying to understand the influence of government organization adaptations, we had to put in ranges of possible behaviors. So they might be able to relocate in 3 days, they might be able to relocate in 2 weeks. And the economic model is able to incorporate this uncertainty and run it a whole bunch of times in order to get a range of impacts. So we're not just saying this is what's going to happen, because we know there's so many other additional factors that are going to influence. And so it's actually a really sort of forward-looking and important way of understanding how we can see transition pathways toward equilibrium, as opposed to saying, this is when the system will reach equilibrium, because a disaster is a non-equilibrium environment. And so it's really about mapping a pathway toward some other functional future. Okay, so the government organizations module. So this is, I put a lot of detail on here. I'll try to keep you awake and move through it fairly quickly, but I think it's super interesting. So, you know, we'll talk a little bit about what went into each step of developing. Oh my God. I'm killing people already. Sorry, Paco, you might have to mute your microphone. So the propagation of uncertainty. So this was one of the main things that we wanted to do better in this particular module. So it was, as I said, incorporating a range of possible hazard impacts. So we actually ran the RiskScape model 10 times, which isn't what is always done. We would have run it 200 times, which is how we ran the government, how many times we ran the government organizations module, but it's just too expensive. So we did with 10, but it was good to get a range, because there was actually quite substantial differences between each run of the RiskScape model. And we also, yeah, as I said, produced a set of merit runs and see if we could propagate this uncertainty through the entire module. And we're working in the future, starting, I think, this year, on actually quantifying some of that uncertainty and understanding it in a bit more depth. We wanted to specify disruptions from building damage, so matching specific government tenants. So we did that. That was really great. And incorporate government-specific productivity implications and adaptations. So these were our goals. This is what we wanted to do, and we did them to the best of our ability. So we have a whole bunch of model assumptions that we built in based on some of the case study and some of the research that we did on government productivity. So we had things like the expected number of days out of a building or in temporary location based on the damage information and based on what we were seeing following the Kaikōura earthquake. So in this particular example that I have here, we're looking at, so it's the number of days of temporary location that a government agency will be in another building, and the number of days it takes them to find permanent relocation sort of spots. Well, the great thing about, I guess, the way that the New Zealand government is managed in Wellington is that the government property group actually managed this for all of the agencies. So there wasn't, like in the Christchurch earthquake, you had a whole bunch of organizations running around trying to find vacancies and maybe taking bad leases or maybe doing things that weren't optimal. But because it was to an extent managed in a centralized fashion for the government, it was fairly efficient. People were able to be, you know, shoved to part of their building, and a whole other department was put into their building, and it actually worked. I think from what we were learning in this very small case study, pretty well, and made things move fairly quickly. So we were able to kind of constrain what we thought the time it would take to relocate and actually get people functioning again in a new building. Permanent relocation. So we looked at the expected time for reoccupation exceeds the, okay, so I won't read that as it's written because I wrote it kind of backwards. But essentially what that means is we wanted to have an understanding of how long a building might be closed before an organization decided, I'm not going to wait for that, I'm going to find a different location. So if we had perfect information, the engineer tells you you're going to be out of your building for 2 years, how long is an agency willing to operate from a suboptimal position before they just go, we'll find another building. So we have a range of responses in that particular assumption. And then, of course, we have the number of days a building can't be occupied due to direct damage. And then we also had to look at a potential coordinating scenario. So we know that in Wellington, they really don't want to do, you know, like the huge giant CBD cordon. They're doing a lot of work to not have that be a situation. So they're trying to just have contained cordons around specific buildings, but of course they will need to cordon. It's a safety issue, and in New Zealand we prioritize life safety above all else. So there will be, if you have a building that's going to be a damaged state 5, the worst category, you're going to have a number of buildings around that they're going to be in a cordon for a period of time. And so we had to kind of actually look at not just the damage to the buildings, but this other building might be super resilient and not damaged, but the agency will still have to relocate for 2 years. So we incorporated that. Okay, step 2 and 3, more model assumptions. Calculating the effective employee hours of lost production. So this is really the nitty-gritty of understanding how government agencies were affected. Employees not working is one thing. So we could calculate if you're not working, your 8 hours a day is lost. But we also have things like if you're in a temporary accommodation, you're not as productive as you would be in. And I think those of us who are undergoing building relocations now or have been through the Christchurch earthquakes, you're in a suboptimal location, you're getting less productivity for a certain period of time, but we assume that it actually normalizes at a certain point. And also looking for things like new employees being brought in to a position to help out. There's actually a lag time in how when they then reach productivity of an actual staff member. So we've all onboarded new staff. It takes a little bit of time. They're not immediately 100% productive on the first day. So we were kind of trying to adjust for those transitions. And again, it's not perfect. We were incorporating fairly wide ranges, but it was just trying to get a sense of how these things move and change throughout that response and recovery period. Adaptation measures, so this is really was critically informed by the case studies that we did. So we have non-essential services and time critical work that needs to be recaptured immediately. So what we saw is that productivity that needs to be recaptured is recaptured by staff working longer hours. A lot of it was what we call relying on corporate citizenship. So you work longer hours because you care about what you do and you're not going to get charged over, you're not paying overtime. But there was a lot of, because it's government organizations accounting for that. So that was probably less so than in private organizations. But there still was a bit of corporate citizenship doing a good thing without getting paid extra, but there was overtime and then hiring extra labor, which came a little after the immediate kind of scramble to catch up on critical services. And then, like I said, reductions in productivity due to training and onboarding. Okay, so lots more parameters to fiddle around with in this module. So we really spent a lot of time trying to decide which variables and parameters we could actually say something meaningful about in a dynamic economic model. And so this is most of them. I haven't included everything, but if you want more detail, everything's in the report in quite a lot of detail. So we, of course, had to look at how many employees from each agency were in each building, the number of days. So we've talked about a lot of these. And the average, one of the main ones was the average lag time between when productive time is lost and recovered. So if you remember that diagram that I showed of the agency 3, I think it was, that had a bit of a dip and then a catch up. Not all of them actually went into overdrive to catch up. So we just were seeing that there was a lag between actually being able to recover that. So it was stretched out over a longer period of time. And in the case of one of our case studies, they just never caught it up. So I'm not sure exactly what that meant for that organization, but they just kind of said, we're just not going to do this piece of work. And that's probably something that I think is very realistic and something to account for in these, there's a little bit of slack and there's things that you're just going to lose and some things that you'll hopefully be able to recapture. So the merit outputs, we have a bunch of timestamps. So it was done as a day run. So day, I think from just day 1, so the impact to day 1 to I think just over a year after the potential impact. So in day 1, after the event, all the model runs that we did, all 200 plus the 10 RiskScape runs, showed that the entire population of government employees were going to be working out of a temporary location. And this is actually what we saw following the Kaikōura earthquake. They're very risk averse. They were out of their buildings immediately. Some people returned to work and then were told to go home. And that's kind of one of the third-party supplier things that we are not totally sure about is, a huge limiting factor for getting back into a building is engineers being available to do these building checks. So, we're assuming that all government employees are going to be out of their buildings at least for a day, and then hoping that there's going to be an adequate supply of engineers. That's going to be a huge limiting factor. And we had, a couple of organizations that were in our case studies that people really wanted to get back to work. Like I said, people really actually do care about their jobs and they want to do them well. So they ran into the office, tried to get lots of work done, told to go home. Then the building was told, they were told it was fine. They all came back in, and they were told to go home later when another inspection was done. So we had this kind of dipping of productivity at 3 or 4 times as they were shuffled around. And again, this was based on a sort of a third-party supplier issue. The engineers, they did a really quick assessment because they needed to do 100 others that day, and it's just something that needs to be accounted for. But again, it fell pretty quickly. The number of people who were in temporary accommodation was actually 46% of all government employees in this particular scenario were out of the building for 2 weeks, and then it attenuates over time. Another one that we looked at is losses in productivity over time. So at the first week, we have between 44,000 and 80,000 hours per day of lost productivity. So that's across the government. And we're looking at that attenuating also a lot more steeply than the temporary accommodation thing. So if we go back, you see that kind of, we're looking at building impacts, but people's ability to recapture their productivity is actually faster than their ability to get back into buildings. We're assuming that people will be able to work fairly well in temporary accommodation once they are settled and have their computers all plugged in, and all those things that you have to think about. Total number of paid employee time, additional employees that needed to be either taken on or overtime paid. So you're seeing a median line run through there, because this is one of the important parts that we pulled out to actually put into the merit model. So it was about 21,000 hours per day after about a week after the event, and it was maintained at higher than 10,000 hours a day for the first month. So there was a lot of additional work going in to recapture that productivity that's lost at that little, you see that loss right at the very beginning. So the additional hours is kind of trying to recapture that, and to also facilitate the emergency functions and all those things that you need to do after a disaster. So there's a lot of additional hustle going on after an earthquake to catch up. But what we were kind of surprised about is that, I guess it's surprising and it's not surprising. There were fairly minimal effects of government productivity losses on the economy. And I guess this does capture what we were saying, is that you can't actually reflect this in the price dynamics of an economy. We did what we could to kind of see how it would propagate to other industries and from the Wellington region to the rest of New Zealand. But what we saw is at the national level, the absolute impact was less than $1 million over the first 2 months. Over 6 months, there's relatively small cumulative change in GDP. And then what you see, in terms of the actual impact on GDP, is that Wellington increases. This is an artifact of a lot of, economic models and just understanding of GDP, is that disasters are good for GDP, but that doesn't actually reflect anything about well-being and the people that are actually functioning. It just means that resources are coming in and they're being sucked from other parts of the country. So that's what you're seeing there. And the largest losses occur in the aggregated industry of government, education, and health, obviously. And that's reflected on expenditures on services from this industry group. So yeah, money is kind of being pulled from certain industries to support the recovery in Wellington CBD. And I have at the bottom there, we haven't captured the welfare impacts. So of course, we know that it's not going to be reflected because of the nature of government services. It's not going to be captured adequately in effects on GDP. It's just not how GDP works. So we're working to try and have a little bit more nuance in utility functions. So we know that if people aren't getting their social welfare payments, there's going to be huge impacts over time, and there's going to be cumulative impacts, and there's going to be work that needs to be done later on to try and remediate those impacts, and all of those things. So these aren't being captured in the current model, but it's something that we recognize and really, really needs to be done better. So that moves us to future work. So we would like to improve our ability to translate case study data into a framework for whole of government plus additional nuance. So more case studies. We weren't able to say this type of agency would be affected in this way. This group of critical agencies would be. We just kind of had to say all of government would respond more or less in this range of behaviors, which obviously can't possibly be true. And then, as I said, there's a project to develop uncertainty quantification abilities within the merit modeling systems. So that's already funded and going ahead, which is exciting. We want to look at future what-if scenarios to develop plausible narratives around the government response functions. So we weren't able to really look at emergency functions in depth and how these actually impact other industries' ability to function. So we're looking at in the GDP measurements, what we were seeing is, okay, this is the kinds of services that are actually not being delivered in the economy as kind of a direct input, but we weren't looking at the government almost as a third-party supplier, because the government is actually essential for allowing businesses to do a lot of what they do. So if they're disrupted, then how does that actually affect other organizations in the economy, other private organizations? So that's something that we need to think a little bit more about and understand the dynamics between government services and their enabling capacity in an economic environment. And then understanding the interaction the other way with third-party suppliers. So how does the disruption to businesses and all of those other things, for example, we actually did a little bit of looking at third-party supplier dependencies in our 4 case studies and saw that actually a lot of them depend on the same banks, a lot of them depended on the same, other third, like printing suppliers and those kind of things. So there are critical vulnerabilities there that we weren't able to capture. So of course, those agencies would be, or sort of private organizations would be affected, and there's going to be effects through the government that we couldn't capture. And that's kind of a little bit of a scary one if you're looking at something like a huge, well, especially a Wellington fault rupture. So this work was funded by QuakeCoRE and the Natural Hazards Research Platform. And we're so grateful to all the participants. Everyone that we worked with on this project from the government was so interested and cooperative, and really, like I said, the New Zealand Government Property group really jumped over some serious hurdles to get us really in-depth data on employee numbers. So we're very grateful to them for that. And if you would like to learn more, we have our report on the ResOrg's website, and we will hopefully be putting it out through other channels soon once we get the full sign-off from Natural Hazards Research Platform. And get at me if you have other questions.
Great, thank you so much, Joe. Happy to take questions from anyone, either directly to Joe here in the room in Christchurch, but otherwise either via video. If you can just, for those people via video, if you can just make sure your microphone's turned back on, and then feel free to ask questions.
So one of the things that I was interested in is you're modelling effects on Wellington, almost with the assumption that it's kind of like Wellington is the big problem on its own. And I wondered what happens if you get a scenario, say your Alpine Fault scenario, affects places like Blenheim, Nelson, and we start propagating down both ways. And actually whether you get to a point where you flip in terms like if you think about mechanisms, you flip from one mode to another mode where actually a lot of things start to not be possible anymore.
Yes, that is something that so for people on the video, the question was asked around what happens when you have impacts that are so severe on other geographic regions of the country, like, for example, Blenheim or Nelson, that you actually start to see what resourcing being drawn in there, or the inability to deliver supplies from those areas, or all of those things that you have to look at in a huge national emergency. And as I said, we weren't able to capture those. I think where you would get more nuance is looking at those third-party supplier dynamics. So if there was a critical government agency supplier based in Lower Hutt or Auckland, you're going to get significant flow-on effects to government agencies' ability to produce. And the same thing if you have, if you looked in, I'm trying to think of, there wasn't so many impacts in Kaikōura because that was very much an infrastructure roading outage. But if you had a significant portion of the population that was then clamoring for additional assistance, that would be increased demand on a whole bunch of government agencies, which would need to reprioritize resources from other parts of their organization. And then that recapture process is going to be drawn out over an even longer period of time. So yeah, you're right. If we looked at the impacts on the customer base and on third-party suppliers in more depth, you're going to see a huge increase in the kinds of impacts that you would have. So definitely, right on.
Interesting talk. I had a question. You mentioned you have considered a range of scenarios, but obviously some of them are more likely to happen than others. Have you considered the likelihood of occurrence for each of them, or you have considered them equally likely?
The way, oh, sorry. So the question was asked, we considered a range of scenarios. So for example, for each of the little parameters in the GMO, the government model, government productivity model, we have a range. So we have from 3 to 15 days, for example. And the question was asked whether we were looking at weighting the ones that might be more likely. And the answer is no, we don't need to, because of the way that that data is treated in the merit model. And I'm sure my colleagues from market economics could get into more detail about how that's done, but it's essentially run like a Monte Carlo simulation. So you're pulling from it over and over again, and that's why we did so many runs. So we should be kind of getting a sense of how a median then emerges from those multiple runs using all of this uncertainty. All of these ranges. But then what we're getting is the accumulation of uncertainty, and quantifying that is a huge challenge that we're trying to grapple with over the next couple of years. Other questions from the computer?
Perfect. Yeah.
From the internet, interwebs?
I've got a question. I'm just interested to know more about how the model might respond to different types of temporary accommodation. Thinking specifically, the ability of staff to work from home, but then also meet up at people's houses in the suburbs where you might be hosting, 7 or 10 people out of one house immediately. And, also then, I guess, considering the competition for temporary accommodation. So it's not just the government that's displaced, it's a whole bunch of private organisations as well who will be looking to take up temporary accommodation within the CBD.
Yeah, that's a really good question, and something that we did discuss a lot. So the way that we treated temporary accommodation was we grouped remote working options in with that. So there were some government agencies that could facilitate remote working, so people working from home, people working from cafes. There's some organizations that couldn't do that. So there's, they might have significant archives that they need to have access to do their work, or their work is actually maintaining a set of archives or historical things, so they actually need access to their buildings. We aren't able to differentiate in that way, just because we didn't have enough empirical data to say these organizations are going to be able to be super flexible in their temporary accommodation options. The point that you made about other people competing for for temporary accommodation actually is more of an issue for other businesses operating in the Wellington environment, because the government property group manages things collectively. They own a lot of their buildings, which gives them a power advantage in those kind of things. So there was complaints from other businesses that I've heard outside of the study saying we were booted from our premises because we were renting and the government said we need it and you're out. And so, yeah, it's a power dynamic in the economy that kind of has flow-on effects. Probably wouldn't be captured in the merit model, but it's a real thing. And in some ways, it's what makes that particular model of government accommodation management fairly resilient for the government themselves. But of course, there's impacts on others, as there is with everything. So, yeah.
Thanks.
Was that Nirmal? Did you have another question?
Thanks, Joanne. Enjoyed your presentation. So this is Nirmal from sunny Auckland today. So I had 2 quick questions, and this is regarding the transport analysis box which you showed. Is it a software, or what kind of a toolbox did you use, or what processes did you use? And that's one question. And the second one is, in your 10 scenarios which you ran, what was different? 10 runs of merit.
Yeah. So to clarify, I'll do the second question first. So to clarify, we did 200 runs of the merit model, and we did 10 runs of the RiskScape model. The 200 runs were just to kind of, because they're, and forgive me for not knowing all the terms in systems dynamic, but I think they're called allostatic. Brendan, do you know the term? There's some kind of allostatic finite difference equations that every time you run them, you get a bit of a different distribution within them. Yeah. So that's why we ran them so many different times. The RiskScape model is a similar sort of thing, but it doesn't incorporate as many changes, and it's a lot more cumbersome. So we only had 10 runs of that. Essentially what you're just getting is giving yourself a range of potential. So it throws in a little bit of a wrench every time because we just don't know all of the factors. And so it's more realistic in the fact that there's going to be things that we just can't predict. So it kind of puts in that randomness. That's probably the wrong statistical term. But on purpose in order to get a range, give us a range. The first question that you asked about the transport model, and I can go back to that slide, way back, way back here. So the transport analysis is something that was not included in this particular analysis. This was something that was developed through a separate project. And there are, I think, some reports emerging on that. Roger, you would know if they've been released.
Yeah, related to the QuakeCoRE.
That's right, and they were developed around the Kaikōura event, and I think that they're out, they're available. Yeah, I was at a presentation where there was kind of a stop the press. They were released, and then they were saying, actually, no, maybe we'll want to think about these a little bit more before they're released. So there's not a huge amount out there that I can give you more information, but hopefully in the next wee while, we'll be able to say a little bit more about that particular module. It's not a software, it's a set of equations.
Is that a name for it?
Normal. Liam here. I can chat to you this afternoon about it. It's a 4-stage, 4-step transport model, origin, destination, matrices, those sorts of things.
Okay, thanks.
Any other questions?
Hi, Joe. This is Ken Elwood.
Hi, Ken.
Hey, I just had a question. When you were talking with the government agencies about their experience from QuakeCoRE, did you ask them whether they how they felt about the performance of their buildings and whether they met their expectations, or did you have any discussion like that?
I mean, that emerged. That wasn't something that we asked about, and that's a really interesting question. People had a range of responses. I wouldn't say that I could say anything meaningful because if I was going to ask that question, I'd want to ask a whole bunch of people within that same organization. But I think people were surprised at the impact in the Wellington CBD from the people that we talked to. I'm sure you might not be surprised, Ken, but people were surprised at the impact on Wellington CBD buildings from something that seemed so far away. Really, I think it was 60 k's south was the nearest of the ruptures. So, and there was fairly significant impacts. And I think that kind of the reason why the government property group was working so hard to help us was because they really are worried about some kind of, they're worried about what more significant shaking would mean for the Wellington CBD. So sorry, that doesn't really answer your question, but I would also love to have the answer to it, Ken.
Well, let's follow up. That's great. Thank you.
Sure. Mark?
Mark, please.
Well, thanks so much, Joanne, but I'm afraid I have half a dozen questions. So it might
Oh God, I'll try. I'll try, Mark. You always have questions that I can't answer.
It might be better for us to do this over coffee.
Yes,
if anyone else is interested afterwards. But, just want to say excellent presentation. I invite others to stick around if they want to ask some other questions.
Sure.
Joe, I've got one question. You mentioned about the critical and non-critical functions. So in the backdrop of this, there's always a lot of discussion in the media as to how long will government centralise a lot of these services in Wellington. So was that another discussion that came up, is them talking about, we're doing this in Wellington, but we don't actually need to. If we moved it, then that would improve our resilience, but maybe reduce our daily productivity because, you lose a critical mass in one location.
Yeah, and the government agencies are aware of those concerns, but it's a really hard decision to make because there are tremendous productivity benefits, years and years and years until you have something. So I think their approach is, let's just make it easy to decamp. And so there is, and I can't say that, like I'm saying, like we only talked to a few agencies, so there might be other approaches, and there might be, more capacity building in other parts of the country. And I think there is for certain agencies who realize that they have a lot of critical functions that they need to maintain. But it's a really hard balance because you are gaining a huge amount of productivity by the government agglomeration that exists in the Wellington CBD. Did you have any thoughts on that one, Roger?
No more than that.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you so much, Joe. Lots of questions is always a good sign. So it was good that you finished early to hear most of those questions.
I was talking very fast.
And just a reminder that these seminars are supposed to be wide-reaching in terms of they're easily accessible to all researchers across QuakeCoRE and of course, stakeholders beyond the QuakeCoRE researcher network itself. And also an open invite to any of the people within QuakeCoRE that there is no invitation to speak at these, so if people are willing and able to do so, then get in touch with any one of the QuakeCoRE leadership team members and express your interest to give a presentation. I'm sure we'd love to hear from you. So with that, thanks very much again, everyone, for attending, and look forward to seeing many of you again next month. Cheers.
Thanks.